other breaking news, this of the conflict between Turkey and the Kurds in Syria and potential evidence of alleged atrocities carried out by Turkish-backed militias. This video appears to show Arab militias executing a Kurd by the roadside as they shout, Allahu Akbar. Multiple U.S. officials tell NBC News that video and photographs, they appear genuine. The Turkish-backed militias, U.S. officials say, include al-Qaeda and ISIS supporters. Now, these other new pictures show damage inside Turkey. Officials say this building was on the receiving end of mortar fire, this from the Kurds. And this is the scene in much of the Kurdish territory under constant shelling from Turkey's army. We have NBC's Keir Simmons and Bill Neely. Both are covering the developments for us in the region. So with a welcome to you both, let's go first to Keir in Urfa. That's on the Turkish side of the border. Keir, we're hearing some new reports of ISIS prisoners now escaping one of the camps. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, that's right. That's a camp that's just across the border from here inside Syria called Al-Nasser. It's a refugee camp, but in it were hundreds of ISIS families, mostly families. Now, there are mixed reports about how many ISIS prisoners have escaped. One report says 785 cited to the Kurds, but another report, again, cited to Kurdish sources, suggests 950. We do know that around about that number of ISIS members were held there, and there are reports from the Turkish side that they have arrived there to find that the ISIS annex, if you like, has been emptied. Of course, what exactly has happened to those people, whether they have been taken into custody and moved somewhere else, well, that is something that isn't clear, but it does seem that many of them are on the run. We're just investigating just exactly who these people are. One of them may well be a fairly infamous ISIS member, a 25-year-old woman from Britain who became known as the matchmaker, was involved in helping women to come to Syria to marry ISIS fighters. She has 2 children. She gave a recent interview in which she said that she was desperate to get back to Britain. Where she is now, where she is going, no one knows. But of course, that is going to ratchet up the pressure on Turkey over this this military move into Syria, and on Washington, on the White House, over them apparently green-lighting the move. And more pressure will come from these pictures that you mentioned at the top there of apparently pro-Turkish militia executing 2 Kurdish fighters who had their hands tied on the road, and another report of a Kurdish politician and women's rights campaigner who reportedly was pulled from her car and again executed. So those people will be describing as war crimes. Already leadership from those pro-Turkish militia here in Turkey are saying that they plan to investigate and to hold accountable any fighters that are responsible for this. But it is, I don't think it's wrong to describe it as chaos on the other side of the border. And I fear that we'll be hearing more stories like this.
Yeah, absolutely. None of the news you're sharing with us is good, but I thank you nonetheless, Keir Simmons, for that. Let's go to Bill Neely now, NBC's chief global correspondent. Bill is joining us from Erbil, that is the capital of Kurdistan. So what about diplomatic efforts? There seem to be several of them to try to end this conflict. Is anything working, Bill?
Yeah, good morning, Alex. I think the short answer is no. The latest was a phone call between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Turkish President Erdogan yesterday, in which Boris Johnson urged the president to stop this invasion. But President Erdogan has made it quite clear we're not stopping, no matter what anybody says. The Arab League condemned him over the weekend. That's not going to make any difference. There is US pressure, and ultimately that could have some effect, certainly economically, because as Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, said, the US does have the power to basically take down the Turkish economy should it want to do that. But look, we're a long, long way from that at the minute. The Turks are driving forward. I think what could have an effect are these increasing and disturbing reports of human rights violations. In addition to the 2 that Keir mentioned, there is an ambulance team that is missing. An NGO has reported them missing near the front line, and I've seen very disturbing photographs of 4 bodies on the ground. It's absolutely not confirmed that that is the ambulance crew. But, you know, US officials will be looking at these reports and trying to weigh up, Do these constitute a war crime? Are they attacks on civilians? Is this evidence of ethnic cleansing? And if it's any one of those, then that for the US would, certainly should, cross some kind of red line, because it would, in the case of an ambulance crew, for example, constitute a war crime. And at that point, at least that's what the Trump administration was hinting last week, at that point, that might be a trigger for President Trump to do something, possibly even sanctions. Just one other thing, Alex, that's broken within the last 10 minutes or so, and it comes from the AP news agency in Beirut. A US official is saying American troops in northern Syria are now at risk of being isolated and could clash with Turkish-backed forces. I would suggest that if that happened, that would certainly be another trigger for deeper U.S. intervention. Alex?
Absolutely. And part of that statement from the AP clearly saying that the situation in northern Syria is deteriorating rapidly. Bill Neely, thank you for that from Erbil. We appreciate you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.